Let me turn to the events of Tuesday. Where were you when you first learned a plane had struck the World Trade Center?
Well, I was in my office Tuesday morning. Monday, I'd been in Kentucky, and the president had been in the White House. Tuesday, our roles were sort of reversed. He was in Florida, and I was in the White House Tuesday morning. And a little before 9, my speechwriter came in. We were going to go over some speeches coming up. And my secretary called in just as we were starting to meet, just before 9 o'clock, and said an airplane had hit the World Trade Center. That was the first one that went in. So we turned on the television and watched for a few minutes, and then actually saw the second plane hit the World Trade Center. And as soon as that second plane showed up, that's what triggered the thought terrorism.
You sensed it immediately. This is deliberate.
Yeah. Then I convened in my office. Condi Rice came down. Her office is right near mine there in the West Wing.
The National Security Advisor?
National Security Advisor. My Chief of Staff, Scooter Libby, Mary Madeline, who works for me, convened in my office, and we started talking about getting the counterterrorism task force up and operating. I talked with the president. I'd given word to Andy Card's staff, who's right next door, to get hold of Andy and or the president, and that I wanted to talk to him as soon as they could hook it up. This call came in, and the president knew at this point about that. We discussed a statement that he might make, and the first statement he made describing this as an act of apparent terrorism flowed out of those conversations. While I was there over the next several minutes watching developments on television, and as we started to get organized to figure out what to do, my Secret Service agents came in, and they, under these circumstances, they just move. They don't say, sir, or ask politely. They came in and said, sir, we have to leave immediately, and grabbed me and
literally grabbed you and moved you.
Yeah, and your feet touch the floor periodically, but they're bigger than I am, and they hoisted me up and moved me very rapidly down the hallway, down some stairs, through some doors, and down some more stairs into an underground facility under the White House. And it's in effect, a corridor locked at both ends. And they did that because they'd received a report that an airplane was headed for the White House.
This is Flight 77, which had left Dulles.
Flight 77. It left Dulles, flown west towards Ohio, been captured by the terrorists. They turned off the transponder, which led to a later report that a plane had gone down in Ohio. But it really hadn't, of course. And then they turned back and headed back towards Washington. As best we can tell, they came initially at the White House. And
the plane actually circled the White House?
Didn't circle it, but was headed on a track into it. The Secret Service has an arrangement with the FAA. They'd had open lines after the World Trade Center was
tracking it by radar.
And when it entered the danger zone and looked like it was headed for the White House was when they grabbed me and evacuated me to the basement. The plane obviously didn't hit the White House, turned away and we think flew a circle and came back in and then hit the Pentagon. And that's what the radar track looks like. The result of that, once I got down into the shelter, the first thing I did, there's a secure phone there, first thing I did was pick up the telephone and call the president again, who was still down in Florida at that point, and strongly urged him to delay his return.
You told him to stay away from Washington.
I said, delay your return. We don't know what's going on here, but it looks like we've been targeted. And
why did you make that judgment?
Well, it goes to my basic role as vice president is to worry about presidential succession. I mean, my job, above all other things, is to be prepared to take over if something happens to the president. But over the years, from my time with President Ford, as Secretary of Defense, and the Intel Committee, and so forth, I've been involved in a number of programs that were aimed at ensuring presidential succession. We did a lot of planning during the Cold War, Tim, with respect to the possibility of a nuclear incident. And one of the key requirements always is to protect the presidency. It's not about George Bush or Dick Cheney. It's about the occupant of the office. And one of the things that we did later on that day were tied directly to guaranteeing presidential succession, and that our enemies, whoever they might be, could not decapitate the federal government and leave us leaderless in a moment of crisis. It's why, for example, when we have a State of the Union speech, and we've got the entire government assembled, president, vice president, congressional leaders, cabinet, and so forth, we always leave a cabinet member out. It's always taken to a secure location. And set up there in case something should happen in the House chamber, so we still have a president.
Did you have any role in Speaker Hastert, Speaker of the House,
Yes.
being taken away?
We evacuated Speaker Hastert to a secure facility, and later the rest of the congressional leadership. I also ordered the evacuation of cabinet members, and so we sent Tommy Thompson and Veneman, Gail Norton, also up to a secure facility. And in the days since, we've always maintained to say I've spent a good deal of my time up at Camp David since the president returned to the White House, just so that we weren't both together in the same place, so we could ensure the survival of the government. The president was on Air Force One. We received a threat to Air Force One. Came through
a credible
the
threat
Service.
to Air Force One. You're convinced of that?
I'm convinced of that. Now, it may have been phoned in by a crank, but in the midst of what was going on, there was no way to know that. I think it was a credible threat, enough for the Secret Service to bring it to me. Once I left that immediate shelter, after I talked to the president, urged him to stay away for now, I went down into what's called the PIOC, the Presidential Emergency Operations Center. And there I had Norm Mineta, Secretary of Transportation, access to the FAA. I had Condi Rice with me and several of my key staff people. We had access, secure communications with Air Force One, with Secretary of Defense over in the Pentagon. We had also the secure video conference that ties together the White House, CIA, State, Justice, Defense. A very useful and valuable facility. We had the Counterterrorism Task Force up on that net. And so I was in a position to be able to see all the stuff coming in, receive reports, and then make decisions in terms of acting with it. But when I arrived there, within a short order, we had word the Pentagon's been hit. We had word that the State Department had been bombed, that a car bomb had gone off at the State Department. Turned out not to be true, but we didn't know that at the time. We had a report that Norm had provided that there were 6 airplanes that might have been hijacked. And that's what we started working off of, was that list of 6. Now, we could account for 2 of them in New York. The third one, we didn't know what had happened to it. Turned out it had hit the Pentagon, but the first reports on the Pentagon attack suggested a helicopter, and then later a private jet. And it was only after we got hold of some eyewitnesses that we knew it was an American Airlines flight. So then we had 3 planes accounted for, but we still had 3 outstanding. We had reports of planes down in Ohio. Turned out not to be true. Down in Pennsylvania. Turned out that was true. And all of that, added with the report of a prospective attack on Air Force One itself, we'd have been absolute fools not to go into button-down mode, make sure we had the successors evacuated, make sure the president was safe and secure. Offutt was a good location for that purpose, and also
in Nebraska.
In Nebraska.
Are you convinced there were only 4 hijackings, that there were not other hijackings attempted that we don't know about?
I don't know. We know there were 4, of course. I don't think until we've completed our investigation, looked at all the ties and relationships, we'll be able to say that there were no other plans for additional planes.
When you made the recommendation to the president, stay where you are, go to a secure facility in Nebraska, were you ever concerned, did it ever enter your thought process that there would be criticism of the president for not coming back to Washington during a crisis?
I didn't really think about it. I mean, it was such a clear-cut case, in my estimation, that the most important thing here is to preserve the presidency. We don't know what's happening. We know Washington's under attack. We don't know by who. We don't know how many additional planes are coming. We don't know what all is planned for us at that point. Within about 35 or 40 minutes, we'd seen this unfolding of this monstrous terrorist attack. And it was absolutely the right decision. I have no qualms about it at all. The president wanted to come back. We talked repeatedly during the course of the day. He made it clear he wanted back as soon as we thought it made sense. The Secret Service did not want him back. They even talked to me, to try to get me to evacuate a couple of times, but I didn't want to leave the node that we'd established there in terms of having all of this capability tied together by communications where we could, in fact, make decisions and act. And if I'd left, gotten on a helicopter and launched out of the White House, all of that would have been broken down. And we had the presidential succession pretty well guaranteed, so I thought it was appropriate for me to stay in the White House.
Symbolisms are so important to terrorists. The fact that George Bush stayed at the White House, you came to Camp David. Are you concerned that that sends a mixed message to the terrorists that they could disrupt our government? Or do you err on the side of caution and safety and keep the 2 key leaders separated?
Well, we erred on the side of, I'd say, responsibility. The when something like this happens, you've got certain obligations and responsibilities you've got to carry out. And those took priority. They did for the president. They did for me. Also with modern communications, I mean, the president was in touch with me throughout the day. We talked repeatedly. He made some key decisions that were very important to the operation. Once he got to Offutt, he convened a meeting of the National Security Council, again using the secure video conference hookup. And
what's the most important decision you think he made during the course of the day?
Well, I suppose the toughest decision was this question of whether or not we would intercept incoming commercial aircraft.
And you decided?
We decided to do it. We'd in effect put a flying combat air patrol up over the city, F-16s, with an AWACS, which is an airborne radar system, and tanker support so they could stay up a long time. Doesn't do any good to put up combat air patrol if you don't give them instructions to act if in fact they feel it's appropriate.
So if the United States government became aware that a hijacked commercial airline was destined for the White House or the Capitol, we would take the plane down?
Yes, the president made the decision on my recommendation as well, wholeheartedly concurred in the decision he made, that if the plane would not divert, if they wouldn't pay any attention to instructions to move away from the city, as a last resort, our pilots were authorized to take them out. Now, people say, you know, that's a horrendous decision to make. Well, it is. You've got an airplane full of American citizens, civilians, captured by hostages, captured by terrorists, headed, and are you going to, in fact, shoot it down, obviously, and kill all those Americans on board? And you have to ask yourself, if we had had combat air patrol up over New York, and we'd had the opportunity to take out the two aircraft that hit the World Trade Center, would we have been justified in doing it? And I think absolutely we would have. Now, it turned out we did not have to execute on that authorization. But there were a few moments when we thought we might, when planes were incoming and we didn't know whether or not they were a problem aircraft until they diverted and gone elsewhere and been able to resolve.
And that will be the policy of the United States in the future?
Well, the president will, I'm sure, make a decision if those circumstances arise again. It's a presidential level decision, and the president made, I think, exactly the right call in this case to say, I wished we'd had combat air patrol up over New York.
More and more, Mr. Vice President, we're finding out, it appears, that the fourth plane that crashed in Pennsylvania crashed because of some real heroism by Americans. Jeremy Glick had called his wife to say he'd been hijacked. She informed him that two planes had struck the World Trade Center, and he said, I think we have to do something.
Mm-hmm. That's true. I think the Washington part of the attack was significantly interfered with. I'm speculating. Some of this is informed speculation. Some of it's based on some evidence. But clearly, we know the plane that crashed outside Pittsburgh was headed for Washington. We know it was part of the scheme. Mr. Glick and others, Mr. Burnett, were very courageous when they made that decision, knowing that they were doomed.
And you've told his wife that, haven't you?
I called Mrs. Glick yesterday, as a matter of fact. Haven't been able to reach Mrs. Burnett yet, but I want to call her too. And I'm sure there were probably others on the aircraft who helped. But what they did was to foil, I think, the attack on Washington. My guess is, speculation, that target probably would have been the Capitol building. It's big, it's easy to hit. I think one of the reasons that the White House did not get hit, I think it turned out to be tougher to see than they had anticipated. When you come in from the west, as American 77 did, unless you get up to altitude a ways, you can't see the White House because the old executive office building is there.
And Treasury on the other side.
Treasury on the other side. And I'm speculating that the lack of ability to be able to acquire it visually may, in fact, have led them to go back.
Gave it up as a target and went to the Pentagon, which is clearly visible.
And speculation on my part. We'll never know for sure. But without question, the attack would have been much worse if it hadn't been for the courageous acts of those individuals on United 93.